The assemblyman will not denounce Hamas. The assemblyman will not denounce Hassan Piker, who said America deserved 9/11.
And I find the comments that Hassan made on 9/11 to be objectionable and reprehensible.
So never have I watched a debate for any level of political office and realized on a deep personal level that we are 100% screwed. And of course, this obviously has to do with the fact that I am a resident of the city of New York. But this New York City mayoral debate was so disastrous. Each and every candidate was so horrible, annoying, or disappointing in certain areas, as is true with Curtis Sliwa, that I genuinely realize that there is probably no hope in the city of New York. We'll have to wait until the gubernatorial election next year when Governor Kathy Hochul hopefully loses to a Republican candidate, because this debate essentially told us what we already know based on the numbers, which is that Curtis Sliwa and former Governor Andrew Cuomo will in fact split the votes, and Zohran Mamdani will likely win, possibly with a plurality, but maybe even with a majority of the vote, the mayorship of the city of New York. A communist is going to be elected as the mayor of my city, and the thing is, the media did nothing but aid and abet him throughout this entire process. Now look, you guys know on this channel that I'm not somebody who's jumped on board the crazy anti-Israel train. You guys know on this channel that I'm somebody who is not supportive of Hamas. I don't downplay their actions or anything of the sort, but one of the most annoying things about this entire mayoral debate is how much time was spent on the nation of Israel. Again, I'm a crazy person because I guess I believe that a mayoral position is a local government position, and thus the questions should be tied to local government duties, not a foreign nation. But apparently the local news media who is running this debate, and by the way, horribly so, and Governor Andrew Cuomo think the exact opposite. They think Israel should be the first and foremost premier issue. And by the way, another person who also thinks this is true is Zohran Mamdani. So yeah, we are going to break this down. We're going to talk about all of this, but before we do, I want to thank everybody who will keep me afloat here in New York City over at actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
The assemblyman just said in his response, well, it depends on occupation. That is code, meaning that Israel does not have a right to exist as a Jewish state, which he has never acknowledged. That is from the river to the sea. That's why he won't denounce globalize the Intifada, which means kill all Jews.
So like I said, the Israel questions are annoying. Again, the mayor of the city of New York should not be a foreign policy position. And while I do understand that we have the largest Jewish population in the city of New York outside of Israel, again, in the world, so I get why to a certain extent Mamdani's beliefs come under scrutiny, the questions that were being asked weren't even good questions on the issue. And by the way, I said that Cuomo is at fault for this, and of course Mamdani is at fault for this, and the reason for that is that's 100% true, because Zohran Mamdani has said in the past that the reason he joined the DSA is based on their Israel-Palestine position.
What brought me to DSA and to the explicitly socialist movement was that it didn't carve out an exception for Palestine. Right. So I know the question is more of like an affirmative one, but for me, it's so obvious and so clear, right? That if you're going to say that you stand for these things within the confines of this border, then why would you say that you don't stand for them elsewhere just because of where it's located in the world? And, and I think that there's even that phrase, right? PEP, progressive except Palestine. And I grew up with that phrase and seeing all these progressive politicians who would talk a big game about something universal, human rights or whatever it may be. And then when it came to Palestine, they would back off and pretend like it was 1995 and they could just say the two-state solution will solve everything.
Zohran Mamdani has said in the past that he will deploy NYPD officers to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, because he believes that New York should not follow United States law. They should follow international law that the United States never agreed to.
Now, to the question around Benjamin Netanyahu, I was asked what I would do after he had just been issued an arrest warrant by the International Court of Justice. My answer is the same whether we are speaking about Vladimir Putin or Netanyahu. I think that this should be a city in compliance with international law, and we have seen other countries across the world who are signatories to the ICC state that they would honor that same request, be it Canada or other countries in Europe. And their honoring of it meant that Netanyahu did not travel there.
And in addition to that, in a recent Fox News interview, Zohran Mamdani refused to call for Hamas to follow the terms of the peace deal, which is, of course, to leave power.
Absolutely. But do you believe that Hamas should lay down their weapons and leave the leadership in Gaza?
I believe that any future here in New York City is one that we have to make sure that's affordable for all. And as it pertains to Israel and Palestine, that we have to ensure that there is peace. And that is the future that we have to fight for.
But you won't say that Hamas should lay down their arms and give up leadership in Gaza.
I don't really have opinions about the future of Hamas and Israel beyond the question of justice and safety and the fact that anything has to abide by international law. And that applies to Hamas, that applies to the Israeli military, applies to anyone you could ask me about.
Okay.
So look, I understand to a certain extent why this information is being brought up. It's not like Zohran Mamdani is not trying to conduct his own foreign policy related to Israel as the mayor of the city of New York. And by the way, everything he says about Bibi Netanyahu, he also applies to Modi. So this guy's essentially promising that if two world leaders who are very likely, if they visit the United States of America, to visit the city of New York, will be arrested based on laws that, again, do not apply in the United States of America. That being said, I'm so tired of this conversation. I'm so tired of this being Andrew Cuomo's attack line, especially when Andrew Cuomo isn't even brave enough to actually label Mamdani anti-Semite, because that's obviously what he's trying to imply, but he's too cowardly in order to do so.
Do you think he's anti-Semitic, Mr. Cuomo?
I don't make those judgments about people. Are you a racist? Are you an anti-Semite? I know there are many Jewish people who believe he is anti-Semitic. I believe not condemning the globalized Intifada, what he has said about Hamas.
But Mr.
I can
Cuomo,
see where they
I covered
are
your,
inflamed.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I covered your speech in an Upper West Side synagogue where you said anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. There is no difference. And you were talking about Mr. Mamdani. Is that not an allegation?
No, I make that statement all the time. I wasn't referring to Mamdani.
And even more annoying, again, from Andrew Cuomo, who has been in politics for decades and decades and decades, is the fact that he wasn't able to effectively call out Mamdani for finally disavowing the comments from Cenk's nephew about America deserving 9/11. And he also wasn't able to call out Mamdani for flipping his position on Hamas, among a whole host of other issues. Now, again, they did spend way too much time on this during the course of the debate, but if you're going to bring it up, then you should also tattoo this man for never answering this question for weeks and weeks and weeks, and then suddenly on the debate stage having a completely different answer. The same thing happened, by the way, with a much more important issue, which is, of course, Mamdani's support for defunding the police.
Are you for defunding the police? Are you for a serious reform that people can see on the ground?
I am in favor of defunding the police.
Which, again, there's about 40 tweets of him saying the police are racist, they need to be defunded, they are toxic to queer people, all these other different various explanations of how he's going to target the police. And even though this was brought up during the conversation, there weren't sufficient follow-ups when Mamdani said that he was no longer of those beliefs.
Mr. Cuomo lies again and again and again. I am not running to defund the police. I am running to actually work with the police to deliver public safety. Andrew Cuomo says that he has stood up to ICE. He has not said a word about the abductions that are happening right now.
He's referring to a previous comment you made, and we will get back to this. But
we need to move on to a crisis that is very important to a lot of voters, and that is people struggling with mental health problems. Roughly 500 times a day, someone calls 911 about an emotionally disturbed person. And in a limited number of those cases, when the person is not believed to be violent, social workers are dispatched instead of police. Mr. Mamdani, you want to do that on a much larger scale. So we want to know, how will this work? When will you send police versus social workers? You have 1 minute.
You know, we have a program here in New York City called Be Heard that is attempting to do this kind of work. But we've had a mayor who has ensured that it's been unsuccessful, to the extent that even when there was an assessment of about 60% of calls that could have been addressed by Be Heard instead of the NYPD, Be Heard was not actually responsive to it. And that's because we haven't had the political will to deliver on what is a crisis that affects so many New Yorkers, which is the mental health crisis. What my plan will do, an innovative plan of the Department of Community Safety, will take what has worked elsewhere in the country, a program in Eugene, Oregon, where they took 24,000 911 mental health calls out of the police department.
they were able to respond to all but 311 without police assistance.
Again, Andrew Cuomo, Curtis Sliwa, Mamdani is still advocating, make no mistake about it, for defund the police policies. He is the only candidate that is on that stage that doesn't want to fill the recruiting gap of NYPD officers, and he wants to create a new department and use the money that they're going to save on police overtime in order to fund it to have social workers deployed to multiple various situations that police were previously deployed there. And if you guys will recall, when people would call out the rhetoric of defund the police, these people would always say, well, what I'm saying is that we're not going to just defund the police. We're going to take money out of their budget and reallocate it so the police don't have to do certain jobs. Well, guess what? Mamdani is still advocating for that. He's just not calling it defund the police anymore, and neither candidate was smart enough to call him out on this particular stage.
When there is a concern for safety or of violence, absolutely, you would have the police there. But what we are doing today is actually ensuring that every single call is going to the police and not allowing them to do the work that they signed up to do.
How will you determine whether there is a concern for safety or violence? What is the line between the calls in which police will be dispatched and the calls to which social workers will be dispatched?
The line is also going to be one focused on violence and the threat of violence. And I also trust the operators who will be receiving those calls to make that determination, as they do every day today for so many emergency services.
In addition to that, nobody really made the case against what Mamdani was saying about how he's going to send social workers to domestic violence calls and wellness checks because there shouldn't be armed police officers there. And the thing is that might sound like it makes sense because those situations don't sound like maybe law enforcement actions, but you never know until you arrive to a scene whether or not you're in a police situation or not. And a perfect example of this that we covered on this channel rather recently is the Sidney Wilson story. Now, I know a lot of you will remember this iconic image where Sidney Wilson is charging with a knife at an officer who she ended up slashing before she was ultimately shot and killed. But what you might not know is that this was a routine wellness check. This guy, the officer, was knocking on the door just expecting to talk to her because not a lot of people had heard from Sidney Wilson and there was some music playing, and she came out with the knife swinging. And so many of these cases start off as regular, ordinary police calls before they devolve into craziness. Again, these defund the police types say that you don't need an armed officer to pull somebody over for a traffic violation, but those go awry all the time in this country, and even an armed officer can end up getting wounded or losing their life. Nobody really made this case. They just kind of let Mamdani spew his absolute nonsense. And again, it's a perfect example of how this debate, by the way, was structured in a way to help Mamdani, because when it seemed like somebody was going to counter, the moderators would interject, they would cut them off, and Mamdani was given free rein to lie time and time again.
Okay, gentlemen, New York City loves its parades, and the mayor is often front and center. You have all said that you want to be mayor for all New Yorkers. So will you march in all the parades that mayors have traditionally marched in, or are there any that you would boycott?
In addition to that, there were so many stupid questions asked throughout the course of this debate that I was genuinely thinking that the people who are moderating this debate or who actually set up this format should be put in jail. A perfect example is the one that I played for you right there, which is, what parades would you not attend as the mayor? Again, who the hell cares?
In a dream scenario, we know it's not possible, but the Mets are playing Game 7 of the World Series on the same night as the Knicks are playing Game 7 of the NBA Championship, and you can only go to one. Which one will it be, Mr. Sliwa?
For that question, which is Knicks and Mets are in the playoffs, they're playing at the same time, which game are you going to if you have to choose? Now, of course, Sliwa said that he's a Yankee fan, so he would choose the Knicks. Mamdani said that he would choose the Knicks as well. Andrew Cuomo said that he would do both, which of course is the weak political answer. But I do want to point out that because the LIRR goes from Penn Station, which is where Madison Square Garden is, to Citi Field, which is where the Mets play, you can actually get between the two in 20 minutes. So even though that's a stupid, weak politician answer, in reality, it actually is 100% possible. But the thing that makes this question stupid, other than the fact that they're asking, what team are you a bigger fan of, even though, again, who the hell cares, is that the baseball playoffs and the NBA playoffs don't even run concurrently. In fact, the NBA season basically starts during the baseball playoffs, and the baseball season basically starts during the NBA playoffs. So this question is so stupid among so many other stupid questions asked throughout the course of this debate to lighten it up. But the thing is, we're on the cusp of electing a communist, so I would like to focus on the fact that we're on the cusp of electing a communist.
While you are a strong supporter of Israel, you have also been slow to develop a relationship with the city's Muslim community. You have called Mr. Mamdani a terrorist sympathizer. How do you assure those New Yorkers, especially Muslims and Arabic New Yorkers, that you will be a mayor for all? You'll have 1 minute.
Yeah, well, first, I think the Assemblyman created the perception himself. Why wouldn't he condemn Hamas? Why wouldn't he condemn Hassan Piker? Why did it take us here tonight for the first time for him to say it? He still won't denounce globalize the intifada, which means kill all Jews. Just say, I denounce it. He won't do it. That's the issue.
Mr.
And his divisiveness
Cuomo, can you address the question
is
that we're putting
chronic.
to you? I think you've made the point, but can you please answer about your own relationship with the Muslim community? You did not visit mosques for many years. More recently, you have been.
Yeah, I don't think in any way the Assemblyman is representative of the Muslim community, which is a vital community in New York City, and I am very fond of and I've been working with. I think he's playing his own politics. Many of his positions don't even follow the Muslim faith, so I see them as two totally separate things.
Mr. Mamdani, want to respond?
You know, it took Andrew Cuomo being beaten by a Muslim candidate in the Democratic primary for him to set foot in a mosque. He had more than 10 years, and he couldn't name a single mosque at the last debate we had that he visited.
Now, after the Israel nonsense in the beginning of the debate, it immediately ended up pivoting into that clip you saw right there, where Zohran Mamdani and Andrew Cuomo were arguing about whether or not Andrew Cuomo had visited enough mosques in the city of New York, and he said it took losing to a Muslim to realize that he has to set foot in a mosque. And honestly, who the hell cares? What happened to no religious tests for public office in the United States of America? If Andrew Cuomo doesn't remember the name of the mosque that he visited, I don't give a damn. Like, I don't care at all whatsoever. Again, the idea that you have to pander to all these different religious groups is just obnoxious and annoying. And again, this is also an example of absolute cowardice from Mamdani, who in other circumstances would call Andrew Cuomo Islamophobic. But in this particular case, he was implying it. He was trying to infer it without actually stating it outright. And again, after the anti-Semitism stuff just before this, that again, they didn't even ask appropriate questions, I'm thinking to myself, I want to die. I don't want to be here anymore. By the way, this is not like legitimate. I'm being dramatic. Everybody relax, because this debate is this horrible. And again, another example, I'm just going to breeze through all the terrible things that happened during this debate in terms of structure of this debate being absolutely awful, is that they had a question about like how you would lure a business to the city of New York or how you would prevent a business from leaving the city of New York. And just to give you an idea of how stupid this was structured, Mamdani was given 1 minute in order to answer this question, which, by the way, he didn't, even though they were saying, look into the camera and speak directly to a CEO and blah, 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 and tell them why New York City is better than Dallas. Then Cuomo was given a variant of that question, but he was given 30 seconds to answer that. Same deal, though. Look into the camera and talk to a business about leaving the city of New York and how that's not a good thing. And then Curtis Sliwa was given the same prompt as Mamdani, even though they changed it for Andrew Cuomo, but he was given no specific timetable. So, of course, when he started to give his answer, guess what happened? The moderator ended up cutting him off because he violated some arbitrary time that was not stated.
What's your go-to breakfast order at the bodega, Mr. Sliwa?
Oh, eggs and cheese on a roll. No salt, please.
Mr. Cuomo?
Same thing. No salt also.
Mr. Mamdani?
Egg and cheese on a roll with jalapenos.
What am I watching right here? This is the debate. This is going to decide or maybe change some voters' minds on who they're going to vote for. These stupid ass questions over and over again, talking about foreign policy instead of the real issues of the city of New York. Absolutely absurd. And again, that doesn't even get into the Trump bad portion of the debate.
Trump simply hearing Trump over and over again.
Which was legitimately the moderators demanding that each and every candidate virtue signal against Trump in some regard. backyard. And by the way, those clips aren't even worth playing. What is at issue, what is important, what should have been brought up and talked about more are issues like the cost of energy, because in the state of New York, Governor Kathy Hochul signed a bill that would force a bunch of buildings, which include apartments and co-ops and condos, to spend huge sums of money in order to make their buildings more energy efficient, including converting from gas to electric. And this obviously is going to add significant costs to those buildings. It's going to add significant costs to those co-ops and condos. And this is going to raise energy bills because there are disincentives and fines and whatnot related to your energy usage. So, of course, what we ultimately end up finding out is that both Mamdani and Governor Andrew Cuomo support this particular legislation, but they think that the fines associated with this legislation need to be raised higher, thus increasing the costs for everyday New Yorkers. Again, while simultaneously they call their agendas affordability agenda.
I want to ask you about climate change. As New York City confronts the impact of climate change, one issue already on the desk of the next mayor is Local Law 97. It's passed in 2019. The law requires large buildings to gradually reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That may require very expensive upgrades to buildings, which some landlords and co-op owners say they just simply can't afford. We're wondering how each of you would enforce the law. You have 30 seconds. Mr. Cuomo.
Local Law 97, I support. Implementing the law is going to be the key, because it has to be done in a way that isn't so disruptive to businesses and residences that they just give up and pay the fine and don't even try to comply, which is what is going to happen now. It will be cheaper for them to pay the fine than comply. And that obviously will accomplish nothing. So, yes, I support the law. Yes, we have to implement it. But we have to implement it in a way that is feasible.
Right. Thank you.
I support the law, and I would also make it easier for condo and co-op owners to comply with the law, because what I've heard from so many is that it's cheaper to pay the fine than to actually get into compliance. And I think the city has a role here in procurement at a large scale of so much of what is necessary in these infrastructure investments. We've seen it be done in the Clean Energy Challenge within NYCHA. It's time to do it right here in New York City to assist those condo and co-op owners in meeting the standards we desperately need to hit.
Now, Curtis Sliwa was against this, and he actually brought up Governor Andrew Cuomo shutting down a power plant that's called the Indian Point Power Plant, which is north of Manhattan. It had been operational for decades in this city, or in the state of New York, but giving power to the city of New York. And Andrew Cuomo doubled down on shutting down this nuclear plant. Mamdani was noticeably silent, and make no mistake about it, if you want carbon-free, affordable energy that is safe, you have to go with nuclear power. And this really pissed me off, because guess what? Governor Cuomo's father, Mario Cuomo, actually shut down what is called the Liper plant in Long Island when it was fully built and ready to be operational. But he did so based on thinly veiled justifications that were backed by environmentalist lobbies pushing green energy, and by the way, also backed by fossil fuels. So that made it so that they're never really going to build another nuclear power plant in this state ever again. Because if New York can pull the plug at the 11th hour on these particular projects, who's going to want to invest the money to build new nuclear plants in this particular city or this particular state? So Cuomo ends up doubling down on the anti-nuclear rhetoric, talking about how there was a 20-mile kill zone with nuclear power.
Mr. Cuomo, Mr. Sliwa.
Local 97 will destroy those people who have invested in co-ops and condos. There's 100,000. It's forcing them to electrify. Now, you, Andrew Cuomo, took Indian Point offline, 25% of our electrical capacity with no replacement, which has caused skyrocketing electricity bills. And now we're going to force condo and co-op owners to electrify. Maintenance fees will go up 30%. These people will be leaving their condos and co-ops. They need relief. When I'm mayor, I slow that process down. We need our co-op owners and condo owners to stay here in New York City and not flee.
Indian Point? Yeah. Indian Point was started before me. It was a very dangerous situation. We have nuclear facilities upstate, and my proposal on what I did is run cables from the nuclear facilities upstate to bring the power to downstate. Indian Point had 20 million people in the kill zone.
And again, I need to make this clear to everybody out there in the audience. Nuclear energy is the safest energy there is. And the worst meltdown in the history of nuclear energy is Chernobyl. Everybody knows this. Mamdani should know this because it was in the Soviet Union, his absolute favorite place in the whole wide world. And guess what? 4,000 people died not from the nuclear meltdown, but from the nuclear meltdown plus the cancers associated with it. And by the way, the other reactors, because there were 4 of them at Chernobyl, did not melt down when Chernobyl melted down. And again, that particular nuclear reactor was built with poor Soviet management and whatnot. That is the absolute worst case scenario. And only 4,000 people over the course of decades died, mostly from cancers, which by the way happened to be the most treatable cancers. So it was actually from Soviet healthcare as a result of Chernobyl. So it's absolute nonsense what Cuomo was saying about the kill area, but again, it is very reminiscent of the Liper plant over on Long Island that was shut down that would have provided affordable energy to Long Islanders. And again, I will remind you that Mamdani also supports this bill that is going to raise your costs. And by the way, Mamdani says that he wants to build a bunch of public housing in the city of New York in order to address the affordability crisis. Now, we know from other projects that have been presented with government money that usually they cost double the proposed project. So he's saying he's going to do it for about $500,000 an apartment, which is insane, by the way, but that means it's actually going to be closer to $1 million. But in addition to that, it's going to have to comply with these energy laws that, of course, Mamdani voted for that are going to add additional costs to the construction and thus prevent projects from going through. So yeah, these two candidates right here are in favor of jacking up your energy bills. They're both anti-nuclear energy, which means, guess what? Their position on climate change is that it's a tool to control you and your behavior, because if you're actually worried about high carbon energy, you would go for the no carbon energy that works, that has been proven to work. And the reason I have to explain this to you is because the moderators absolutely did it. Now, of course, I want to move on to housing policy because Mamdani has been caught lying yet again.
Well, I'm proud to say that I will freeze the rent for more than 2 million rent-stabilized tenants, and I will also build 200,000 truly affordable homes across the 5 boroughs over the next 10 years to ensure that tenants, whether rent-stabilized or market rate, can actually have more housing such that they are not being priced out of this city. And finally, I'm also going to make it easier for the private sector to build housing in this city, because what we see today is that it's not labor, it's not materials, it's the weight that is often costing so much to actually build the housing we need in this city.
Now, Mamdani, again, like many of his positions that he decided to change on the spot during the course of this debate, said that he's going to allow public and private sector developments to come to fruition in the city of New York as the mayor of the city of New York. But make no mistake about it, his position has been 100% clear from his website from the jump that he is only going to approve private sector projects. Again, this is straight from his website if they end up meeting his standards of affordability and sustainability. So essentially, Mamdani is going to use the regulatory state in order to block private developments, or again, add so many restrictions that you get to the point where they can't actually have a project that makes sense, or they have to pivot it to luxury projects. And this is exactly what we see from standard progressive NIMBYs. And by the way, nobody should be surprised by this because the Democrats are splitting on the housing issue. There's the Ezra Klein abundance category, and he would back somebody more like Andrew Cuomo, who of course goes with the wind and is not going to be great on housing policy. But again, since he doesn't really have any beliefs and he goes with trends because he only cares about his own personal political future, he might technically be better. But then you have the Mamdani types, and everybody that endorses him, guess what, is in that NIMBY camp. And that is reflected in his platform because these are people who believe that private developers increasing supply through them is an absolute evil. And more fundamentally, Mamdani has made it clear that he believes it's the government's role to basically bog down these buildings, bankrupt them, and of course, seize them.
Go further toward the Vienna model. We'll have to go beyond the market. We can establish community land trusts to gradually buy up housing on the private market and convert it to community ownership. We can give tenants a right of first refusal to buy out their landlords when buildings go up for sale. And we can fully commit to a new era of social housing, ending subsidies for luxury housing development and using our wealth to build beautiful, high-quality social housing projects that offer good homes and strong communities to everyone. We won't decommodify housing overnight, but we know what we have to do. and we have history to guide us.
Now again, Cuomo, like Gavin Newsom recently, where he signed a bill that was actually good in the state of California as it relates to zoning regulations in their cities, will likely go with the wind. So even though, again, overall, I like Curtis Sliwa the most out of the people on the stage, the fact is, I can't lie to you guys. He had one of the worst answers among the people on that stage, which was, of course, he wants to protect zoning, but his alternative for how you're going to build more housing is to convert office buildings into housing.
And then in terms of rentals, we have affordable housing that can be built in these huge skyscrapers. You see them all throughout Manhattan and in northern Brooklyn and in Long Island City, which we have 25 Empire State Buildings full of commercial space that will never be occupied for office space. We should be converting them into affordable apartments. They're in dense areas. The infrastructure can support it. I'm the only candidate here who's against the city of yes that would destroy residential neighborhoods.
I have to interrupt you because...
Now look, guys, this might sound good if you don't really think about it, because there's a bunch of office space and office buildings all over the city of New York, and office buildings from the outside superficially look a lot like apartment buildings, so a conversion should be quick and easy. But the thing is, in reality, it's the inside that counts. All beauty is on the inside, guys. And this is actually going to be more expensive and more cost prohibitive than actually tearing down office buildings and building up homes. Because the fact is, the way the plumbing is laid out in your home, in your apartment, is completely different than the way it's laid out for a business, for an office. And adding in all of that plumbing work essentially means you're going to have to rip up all these floors, install new pipes, rerun the water, get gas lines in, because a bunch of offices don't have gas lines, or you could go with electric stoves if you're an absolute loser. But the fact is, there are a whole bunch of things, including the fact that you have light requirements, which means the positions of the windows need to be in a certain way, that are completely different for an office versus, guess what, a private residence or an apartment. So the idea that you're going to solve the housing crisis by converting a bunch of unused office buildings, which, by the way, I'm assuming you would have to buy the office buildings, then get financing in order to convert them, follow all the regulations, which, by the way, are completely different to how these buildings are constructed for offices versus apartments, and that is going to be a workable solution, is not only absurd, ridiculous, and stupid, but guess what? We have proof of that because Eric Adams implemented this policy like a year into his mayorship, and guess what? It didn't work. It didn't lower the rent.
And for the record, what is your monthly rent or mortgage, Mr. Sliwa?
About $3,900. It's not subsidized there. So
Mr. Mamdani, what is your monthly rent or mortgage?
$2,300.
Mr. Cuomo.
He has a rent-stabilized apartment that a poor person is supposed to have. Mine is about $7,800.
So what I just played you right there was, of course, every candidate talking about how much they pay for rent or their housing payment in the city of New York. And obviously, Andrew Cuomo's was the highest right there. Curtis Sliwa's was $3,900, the second highest. But Zohran Mamdani's is $2,300. And by the way, you might be thinking this is because Mamdani is living quite frugally. But no, that's not actually the case. It's because Zohran Mamdani represents everything that's wrong with the rent control and stabilization program, because Zohran Mamdani has an apartment in Astoria, Queens. Astoria, Queens is an absolutely lovely neighborhood that in a lot of ways represents some of the best parts about New York City, but it also represents some of the worst parts in that a lot of the apartments there are extraordinarily expensive. However, there are rent stabilized apartments that if you can get into, you could pay significantly lower rent than the general public. Now, of course, Mamdani is a state legislator in the state of New York. He voted for his own pay increase to make state legislatures in the state of New York among the highest paid representatives in the entire country. He's pulling in like $180K from that position. But worse than that, he's the child of millionaire filmmakers, and his wife is an even richer Nepo baby than him. And these are the people that are getting subsidized rent by the taxpayers. Now, again, he's not getting a handout. Let me be clear about that. But the thing that you need to understand about rent stabilization is that in the city of New York, a lot of these buildings are like mixed in terms of some stabilized units and some not stabilized units. And of course, the overall housing market is interconnected like everything in the economy. So when you have an artificially lower rent that, again, depending on the size of his apartment, could be a third less to half of what a New Yorker would pay in order to live in Astoria, then you are having somebody else pick pick up that cost somewhere else in the city of New York, if not in the same building. And it just makes sense because the cost of maintaining a building does not stay stagnant when the city says that you have to do rent stabilization. It goes up with inflation. It goes up over the years as buildings decay and whatnot. But the thing is, if you're only capped at the general cap for rent stabilization apartments at that 1.5%, unless the stabilization board votes otherwise, then guess what? You're not paying the full cost of that particular apartment. Somebody else is paying it. Either it's the small landlord that likely owns that building that Mamdani lives in. That, by the way, again, let me add, Mamdani is richer than, his family is wealthier than the person that he rents from, or it's the other tenants that are paying it in higher rent. This is why, even though we have 44% of our apartments in the city of New York under this rent stabilization program, rent doesn't go down in the city of New York because these policies absolutely backfire. And by the way, in San Francisco and Los Angeles, they have between 60 and 70% of their apartments in rent stabilization. And this has been proven time and time again that when you have these programs, it jacks up the prices of the market rent. It actually prevents future construction because, again, in the city of New York, when you do new constructions, you have to reserve some of these buildings under rent stabilization. And that lack of supply ends up, guess what? Increasing the prices because demand is going up. But Mamdani, completely unaffected by it, he's able to take advantage of this government program. And even more ridiculous, he wants to freeze rent, which, by the way, is illegal for him to do as the mayor, which was brought up to him during the course of this debate.
Thank you. And a follow-up for you, Mr. Mamdani. The cost of maintaining a building change year to year for landlords. The Rent Guidelines Board is legally required to consider those costs when deciding whether to freeze rents. So how can you promise a rent freeze today before ever seeing that data next year?
You know, we've seen the data time and again.
It's next year's data.
It's been data that's been overruled by mayors again and again. The last Rent Guidelines Board study showed that profits were up 12% for landlords of those units. And what did they do? They raised the rent, adding to more than 12% under Eric Adams' administration. What I'm speaking about is actually reflecting the needs of these New Yorkers and the state of the market today. These are New Yorkers who have a median household income of $60,000. We do not need to be pushing them further out of the city. We need to keep them in their homes.
Aren't you saying in that answer that you are going to prejudge? You will not have seen the data for next year, and you're making a determination based on data you haven't seen?
I've seen the data year after year of the fact that salaries are stagnating, costs are up, New Yorkers can't actually afford their apartments. And I will also take action to actually ensure that the landlords of those buildings can better handle their costs by taking on their insurance, their property taxes, and their water bills.
And you haven't seen next year's data yet, but we're going to go to the...
And that freeze is for rent-stabilized tenants like himself. And again, you could see the difference. You can see the variance in what he's paying for upscale neighborhood in Queens, New York versus Sliwa versus Cuomo, who are paying the market rates for their respective neighborhoods. Again, Zohran Mamdani, despite the fact that he's a millionaire and I grew up in a single-parent household, despite the fact that he had everything handed to him throughout the course of his life, absolute nepo baby, mom put him in Disney movies in order to start his acting career, still managed to parlay that into a failed internet rap career. This guy is paying less for his rent than my wife and I are paying for our rent right now. And guess what? We don't live in a neighborhood that is anywhere near as nice as the neighborhood of Astoria. And I'm significantly further away from the city than Zohran Mamdani because not only is Astoria nice and an up-and-coming neighborhood that is very desirable to live in, but guess what? It also has very quick public transit options in order to get you into Manhattan quickly. Again, you can get to downtown Manhattan in 15 to 20 minutes, and that's if you have a significant walk to the train from where Zohran Mamdani lives.
You know, you've heard it from Andrew Cuomo that the number one crisis in this city, the housing crisis, the answer is to evict my wife and I. He thinks you address this crisis by unleashing my landlord's ability to raise my rent. If you think that the problem in this city is that my rent is too low, vote for him. If you know the problem in this city is that your rent is too high, vote for me.
If I understand it correctly,
Sons of millionaires
your
need
program,
subsidized housing.
would not evict Mr. Mamdani.
It would not evict.
It would apply to people applying for apartments. But the tenant advocates.
It would evict no one.
So yeah, rich kid Mamdani and his rich wife get one of these apartments. They hold it down forever. And again, this is the exact problem that we have with supply and demand in the city of New York. Because guess what? Once you have these apartments, you never leave. You try to pass it on to somebody else. And that ends up hurting inventory in the future because the supply of apartments doesn't go up, which is why even though New York City has has been losing population, somehow rents are still going up because we have done, through the policies that Mamdani advocates for, the very things that destroy the actual way that a market is supposed to run. And also, I pointed this out, Texas has no rent control, no rent stabilization. You look at the Texas Triangle, rents are going down now because they build, not up. There's obviously a way out of this, but we don't go that way. And by the way, Mamdani, like I said, is going to break the law in order to get his rent freeze because, of course, the mayor is not technically supposed to intervene with that, which was told to him, but he said he's going to do it anyway.
This is not a new plan that the Assemblyman is talking about. It's Bill de Blasio's plan. It was called Freeze the Rent. Bill de Blasio says the mayor can't say legally he's going to freeze the rent. There's a rent guidelines board. There are certain considerations that have to be looked at. You're right, Sally. You can't say today, but it's going to be in 4 years. Also, freeze the rent only postpones the rent because then you have to have an increase to cover the costs. Otherwise, the building is going to go bankrupt. And it does nothing for the majority of renters who aren't in these rent-stabilized units. There's nothing for NYCHA. There's nothing for homeowners. There's nothing for people in black-brown communities who are getting priced out.
Now, again, there's so many problems with this particular policy that never get brought up in this particular debate, that never get brought up in this conversation, that we've talked about time and time again on this channel before, not limited to the fact that there are a bunch of buildings in the city of New York that it's actually less expensive to not rent these buildings out because they won't suffer the wear and tear because the maintenance costs are so out of hand because their rents are set too low by this stabilization board. Again, we covered a TikTok that went viral that was talking about greedy landlords and how they don't want to rent the apartments out because guess what? They won't make enough money.
All right, this building right here is the 8 of nearly 100,000 vacant apartments that are in New York City. This is 2nd Avenue, which is prime real estate where the average 4-bedroom goes for $6,000. I'll show you another completely vacant building about 200 feet away. Now, why are all these buildings vacant? These apartments continue to sit vacant because of a law that was passed in 2019 called the Housing and Stability Tenant Protection Act. Very well intentioned, very poorly executed. Big picture, what the law did is when someone moves out of a rent-stabilized apartment, let's say they want to move to Florida or they pass away, they eliminated the landlord's ability to raise the rent at a reasonable level. So now when someone moves out of a building, the landlord's like, it doesn't make economic sense to renovate the apartment, and they take the tax write-off and let that apartment sit vacant. Here's another completely vacant building. Look at that. That building's been vacant for over 5 years. So you can read all about it. So every single day as these apartments are being moved out of and they are not being renovated, New York City becomes more and more unaffordable.
And we actually looked into that particular building only to discover that despite the fact that that building was in downtown Manhattan in premium real estate territory where you could easily get $4,000 for rent, that the tenant that was remaining, because there was only one left that the landlord was begging to leave, offering tens of thousands of dollars to leave, was only paying $350 a month for rent because that building had its price locked in like 70 years ago or something like that, something insane. So yeah, you can't operate a building in the city of New York or probably anywhere on $300 a month for rent. So yes, you've created a situation where prices are so high, but even people with supply, because you put price controls on it, don't want to introduce it into the market because they would lose significantly more money than they lose with just maintaining unoccupied buildings. But also, this is a part of a pattern of Mamdani's campaign style that needs to be addressed because technically, legally, it is not legitimate for the mayor to state what the policy goal is to the rent stabilization board, and this can actually lead to court challenges to overrule their ruling, but Mamdani is openly campaigning on it and openly saying that he won't even look at or have the stabilization board look at next year's cost assessment for these buildings. So obviously that's illegal, but in addition to that, these are promises that he can't actually hold up to, that if he doesn't get them through, he'll just be able to blame it on external factors, thus scapegoating responsibility, which, by the way, is something that he was doing with the rest of his agenda. When he talked about how he's going to pay for the $10 billion in additional spending that he wants to add to New York City's budget, which, by the way, already for the city is over $115 billion, which rivals, if not surpasses, the budget for the entire state of Florida. And of course, Mamdani says that the way he's going to do it is raise taxes on the rich and corporations, which is standard fare for these progressive politicians. But guess what? the city does not have the power to implement those tax increases without state approval, and Governor Kathy Hochul has said that she will not support the high income tax increase that Mamdani is advocating for, and she has been lukewarm to borderline against the corporate tax increase, which Mamdani does not have a good response to.
How you'll make them free?
We will fund the revenue that would have otherwise been brought in from fares, and that's something that we would do in partnership with Albany, and I put forward two proposals. The first is to raise taxes on the top 1% of New Yorkers by 2%. That would raise $4 billion. The second is to raise the state's top corporate tax rate to match that of New Jersey, which would raise $5 billion.
We're going to move along, but I just want to point out to viewers that Governor Hochul has opposed raising the income tax.
I mean, guys, this guy's a charlatan. He's a fraud. That's the other thing that you need to understand. He is promising you things and saying that he's going to pay for it with powers that he will not have as the mayor of the city of New York, and people are buying into it hook, line, and sinker. And when confronted on this, Mamdani, who's supposed to be Mr. Authentic, who's supposed to be not like your ordinary politician, gave one of the most canned politician answers that doesn't mean anything humanly possible.
Get a sense of how all of you would pay for your big ideas. Mr. Mamdani, we'll start with you. We've obviously been talking about free buses. You've talked about free childcare, city-run grocery stores. So essentially you're proposing about $10 billion in new spending. And as you've indicated, you want to pay for it with tax increases. But as Sally pointed out, Governor Hochul said no to raising income tax on millionaires. So tell New Yorkers tonight how you're going to pay for all of this in 1 minute, if you can.
Look, a lot of people have called even my campaign a non-starter when we first began. And now I stand before you proud to be the Democratic nominee who got the most votes in city primary history. And I believe we will see the same thing with our push to ensure that we are taxing the wealthiest and the most profitable corporations the fair amount that they should pay.
Again, the question was, Mr. Mamdani, how are you going to raise taxes as the mayor of the city of New York that you don't have the power to raise as the mayor of the city of New York, because those are under the control of the state? And he's like, a lot of people didn't believe in our campaign, but we got out there and we won our Democratic primary campaign. Like, are we serious right now? Is this really what the kids think is authenticity? Are you stupid? Let's get into the bus thing as well, and then I'm going to wrap this video, because honestly, I'm starting to get a little bit angry. I'm starting to get a little bit upset because I live in the city of New York and I'm watching him be sold down the river by this absolute scumbag, and dumbass Andrew Cuomo is absolutely useless. And let's be honest, Curtis Sliwa, not a very serious candidate. I would love if he won the mayor of the city of New York, but he's not going to win the mayor of the city of New York. Again, I'm just saying. I'm just telling you guys probably how it is.
Can you explain how you will make buses free? You have 30 seconds to answer.
Absolutely. We will make buses free by replacing the revenue that the MTA currently gets from buses. This is revenue that's around $700 million or so. That's less money than Andrew Cuomo gave to Elon Musk in $959 million in tax credits when he was the governor. And the reason that we will do so is that making buses free doesn't just provide economic relief, but also public safety. Because what we've seen is that it decreases assaults on bus drivers by 38.9%. New Yorkers deserve more than the slowest buses in the country. I know that because I was on the M57 not too long ago, and its average speed is 4.9 miles an hour.
We're at time, though, but the question is...
So Mamdani talks about the free bus program right there, and he says, by the way, one of the benefits of the free bus program is that people who used to attack bus drivers, which, by the way, Mamdani is a supporter of bail reform. Curtis Sliwa actually called both of them out early on because he said that Cuomo was the architect of bail reform and Mamdani was the apprentice.
We have the architect and we have the apprentice of no cash bail, which has been a disaster. We have the architect and the apprentice here of raise the age. My own son was almost killed because of that in a gang attack. We have the architect and we have the apprentice of close Rikers Island, which would just release criminals in the street. Thank God I'm not a professional politician, because they have helped create this crime crisis in the city that we face, and I will resolve.
But Mamdani's actually worse than Cuomo on this, because while Cuomo passed bail reform because he thought it would help him with his presidential prospects, Mamdani actually believes in it. But Mamdani's making the case that free buses are good because it reduces assaults on bus drivers, because guess what? A lot of the criminal types get angry when you ask them to pay their fare, so then they attack the bus driver. So Mamdani's like, guess what? This program would lower crime, even though it would cost $700 million, close to $1 billion, actually more than that, which we'll get into a little bit later. but this is absolutely stupid and ridiculous. So we talked about this a million times on this channel, but part of the reason why New York City went from very similar in terms of homicide rates and violent crime rates to the city of Chicago to suddenly the safest big city in the United States of America, and even with the recent crime increases, still able to maintain a comparative safety to places like the city of Chicago, is because we started doing things like enforcing fare evasion, because it turns out when you arrest people for paying for the fare, you actually have downstream positive effects on criminality throughout the city of New York. And the reason for this is that typically the people that would assault you, typically the people that would commit other heinous crimes like robbery, all sorts of terrible things, are not people who are concerned about whether or not they're paying for the subway. So when you arrest them for that and you bring the processing down there, as was done in the late 80s when Bratton was the transit police chief and continued when he was moved up to the NYPD police chief, you end up finding warrants, weapons, all sorts of things that allow you to get dangerous repeat offenders off the street, and then, of course, prevent people that would go on to commit crimes later on in the city from getting into the interior of the city. So this is an absolute fact. It's absolutely proven. And by the way, in addition to that, they were able to reduce fare evasion by something like 65 to 75%, which ended up getting more money for the city through the deterrent effect. So all of these positive downstream consequences on the overall city's crime rate ended up happening as a result of that. But Mamdani is talking about just assaults on bus drivers that were down because some of these criminals attack bus drivers because they demand that they do the proper thing and pay for fares. Well, what do you think happens to those individuals who are no longer attacking the bus driver over a couple of dollars when they get into the city and they want to target somebody else for some kind of petty crime? That violence is felt in the city. But in addition to that, we're not only going to lose the money that we're currently getting for the MTA for this bus program, because guess what? There's also going to be changes that Mamdani nor anybody on the stage are accounting for. Because think about it. The subway system in New York, which Mamdani is not offering to make free, is more efficient in most cases than the buses. They go below ground, they don't have to deal with traffic and all of that, and they get people to and from at a much faster pace than do city buses. But guess what? If you have to choose between faster and free, certain portions of the population are going to choose the free option because they want to save that money. So a lot of people who would be riding the more efficient subway are going to opt for the less efficient buses, thus overloading the buses, thus causing the city to spend more money on additional buses. And guess what? That's going to raise the cost over there for the MTA in terms of bus service, while also lowering revenue not just for the buses, but for the subway system. And again, the reason for this is because incentives change people's behavior, and everybody understands that in certain contexts when it's convenient for them, but as soon as it becomes inconvenient for them, they throw that out the window. So yeah, you're going to lose money on both ends. But by the way, Mamdani doesn't give a damn about losing money, because when Curtis Sliwa talked about stopping the 2nd Avenue line, Mamdani said it's absolutely needed.
Take away the Q train project. We don't need those 3 stations going from 96th Street to 125th. It's not a necessity. Sit with the president and whoever he delegates and try to negotiate. But if you try to get tough with Trump, the only people who are going to suffer from that are the people of New York City.
Okay, Mr. Sliwa, thank you. Brief response, Mr. Mamdani.
You know, Mr. Trump is already suspending infrastructure grants to this city, and he's doing it in a blatant act of political retribution. And what it requires is leadership that will stand up to him. And I disagree with Mr. Sliwa. We do need to extend the 2nd Avenue subway to 125th Street. It was a promise made to Harlemites decades ago. Okay. It's time to actually fulfill it.
Thank you, Mr. Mamdani.
Honestly, guys, I've talked about the 2nd Avenue line so many times on this channel, but I need to give you a quick rundown so you can understand why Curtis Sliwa is 100% right and Zohran Mamdani is not only 100% wrong, but is proving that he is going to be the same corrupt garbage that we've seen in the city of New York for a very long time. So first and foremost, the 2nd Avenue line is objectively not needed, not something that's essential like Mamdani is telling us. And the reason we know why is that the 2nd Avenue proposal was brought into New York at a time when there was a High Line that was going to be decommissioned that went up the east side of the city of New York. That High Line was decommissioned in like 1912. or 1920 at the absolute latest. And guess what? People have adapted in the over 100 years that it took them to figure out a way to do part of this project. But in addition to that, the Second Avenue line has such an insane cost that really, genuinely, you guys need to understand how corrupt New York City's subway system is by not just the cost, but of course the context of the cost. So it currently costs this project $4.3 billion per mile of track in order to build the Second Avenue line, which means that the mile in change that they're going to build in order to add the 3 stations that Mamdani says are absolutely essential will run the city of New York, or the MTA, over $7 billion. Now, the Paris Metro, which is heavily unionized and has had boondoggle projects that have blown up out of proportion, has a maximum cost that they've ever spent on their metro system, which again is underground tunnels, very similar, comparable city, all that. And that maximum cost was $450 million per mile. That was their biggest boondoggle in the history of their system. So New York's MTA, the people who build our subway, are blowing 10 times the most inflated project in the history of France's metro on this unnecessary line that's meant to replace an over 100-year-old High Line. And by the way, I want you guys to understand that there is another train that runs parallel to the track that the Second Avenue line is trying to build. It's like 2 blocks walk away from where the Second Avenue line is. So if you're on Second Avenue, all you have to do is walk past 3rd and Lexington, and guess what? You have a train station that goes basically a parallel route. It already exists, and in 100+ years, New York have adapted. But this is Mamdani. He's going to incinerate that money because guess what? It's not money being spent on building that train line. It's money being spent on lining the pockets of a core constituency, which is the Transit Workers Union, which is the consultants, which by the way, the consultants for the Second Avenue line have already made something like $700 million just on consulting. And I will remind you that they're building like a mile to maybe a mile 7 of track. And again, the Paris Metro would have spent that $600 million actually building the track in a boondoggle project. But none of this gets brought up. None of this gets talked about during the course of this debate. None of this gets talked about during the course of the conversation about this because the moderators and everybody kind of plays along with the corrupt constituencies like the MTA, and you're not really supposed to expose what's going on. Also, I would just point out for you guys out there in the audience, if you're unaware, New York does not have enough money to maintain the current subway tunnels, which was brought up by Sliwa, which I'll give him credit for, that we have. So the idea that you are going to buy something completely new, it's like your home is getting foreclosed on or condemned. It desperately needs repairs, and you go out and you buy a luxury sports car. It's just insane. But Mamdani doesn't care about numbers, doesn't care about math. He's going to run this city into the ground. And guess what? Because nobody can actually press this guy on the issues. Instead, they're talking about Israel. He's going to get a free pass to do so. But you know what? Those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think about this debate down in the comments below. As per usual, if you like the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social medias, support me, the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about the absolute madness in the city of New York. Till next time.